Hello and welcome to the Virtuous Life. I'm your host, Pat Odie Murray, and today I want to talk about a book that I think you might enjoy. The author of this book no longer gives interviews, but he did a number of years ago, and I think I had him on my show a couple of times. But it's called Turning Points, How 13 Remarkable Men and Women Heard God's Call. So during this month of November, where we really focus on kind of the eschatology of the church and the saints, and we're moving toward the Feast of Christ the King, where we celebrate the kingship, and then we move obviously into the season of Advent, I thought this would be an interesting book because I think for all of us, we may point to a time in our life where this was a turning point for me. Okay, now I don't know what that looks like in everyone's life. I think the saints are good examples for us. Now there are some who I feel are kind of like my life. I was a cradle Catholic, and I'm don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I'm a saint. The minute that slipped out of my mouth, I'm thinking, oh no, I don't want anybody to think I think I'm a saint. I certainly don't. I'm very well aware of my flaws. But I was baptized Catholic, very Catholic family. We prayed the rosary every night together as a family. We were very active in our church. My sister played organ for Mass. In fact, she still does at a different parish than we were raised in. I have a brother who's a priest. I had an uncle. My mom's brother was a priest. So we were I always say we were marinated in Catholicism. We had May altars. We did a lot of devotional things that pulled our faith, our beliefs into every area of our lives and every season of our lives. It wasn't just a Sunday thing. So, people, and I've had people say to me, you give talks and you do all this stuff and you give retreats and you do missions and you have a brother that's a priest, and how did your family get this way? And I just said, well, probably a lot of prayer and grace from God. I know my parents tried really hard to keep us faithful, but at some point, even in a life like mine where I was a cradle, they talk about us as cradle Catholics, right? You have to make a choice. You can't just go through the motions. You can't just whip into church on Sunday morning for a quick mass and head back out again and go on like it has no meaning. You're just trying to stay out of hell. Okay? And unfortunately, I think sometimes we get to be that way, right? Okay, let me check this off my list because I just don't want to go to hell. But all of us, and I think as a cradle Catholic, I can kind of point to a time that was a turning point in my life where things changed. And by changed, I mean they became real to me, more real. And that was when I made a Teens Encounter Christ back in my junior year of high school. My brother happened to be the spiritual director on that retreat, and I went with a couple of friends from high school, and reading scripture came alive during that time. Having people talked about the sacraments and personalizing those things to make it real, not to make it egoistic like it's about me, but to make it real, to show how it all fit in our lives and the reality of it and why we needed it. And then I think at that moment in my junior year of high school, I kept looking for those kinds of experiences and have grown deeper and deeper and deeper. And I still, there's still certainly a part of me that wants to make faith about me, telling God what I always want. And this is kind of the next turning point in my life, I think, when I finally am just trying to let it go and let it in his hands and know, I think it's Julian of Norwich, it says all is well, all is very well, something like that. But that idea that there is something more here, and to try to meditate on the scriptures and identifying my life in those passages and how I can live for God. And then knowing that all things are well. My soul is well. All is well with my soul. Write that song. Because he's got it. Now, and in order to live that way, we have to open our hands. We have to let go of what we want, or sometimes what we think is best for us. And so to me, in my life, that has been another, as this book would call, turning point. So I think we all have them in our lives. Some are very dramatic. You know, you hear people who were an atheist and something happened, or they had quit going to church and now they're an alcoholic and something bad happens and they turn around and come back to the Lord. There are what I call dramatic conversion stories. And this book, Turning Points, again, I do recommend, if you're thinking about, I'd like to know a lot. I'd like to know about more saints and not necessarily in depth on one of them. This is a great book to do that. There are 13 of them. It's not a really long book. I mean, it's not like hundreds of pages. And you get the snapshot of this person's life, and then you get Shaw's insight into the whole idea of, what's the word I'm looking for here? Shaw's insight into the conversion. Sorry, I just had a text come through. Pop up on my screen. It distracted me. So anyway, okay, so I want to do that, and I want to look at some of his saints, or some of the people. Now, not all of them are saints. Okay, he said remarkable men and women who heard God's call. Now, the majority of them are saints, and they're people you know about. And there are some that, I wish I could talk to Russell Shaw and see why he said this was the turning point, what he saw. Now, as I was reading this book, my brother and I were having some discussions, and sometimes I just ask him, even though he didn't read the book, because I was curious. Could you see this as being a turning point in this person's life? So let's start. I think the first 4 in the book are fairly obvious. And it's, by obvious, I mean you have heard their conversion stories. You kind of know a little bit, you might know a little bit about them, and you know what it was that brought them to the Lord. So first of all, St. Paul, right? I must admit, the thing that I love about St. Paul is his enthusiasm. He is just zealous, right? He is just zealous. And we see how he uses his zealousness to persecute Christians. That's what we see at the end of the Acts of the Apostles. I shouldn't say the end, but we see it where he is, no, it's not the end, I'm sorry, where he is persecuting Christians. And he believes he's doing a good. He believes that it's a dangerous religion. It is causing issues for good Jews. And he believes it's his job to stop it. And so we see the stoning of Stephen. St. Stephen is a part of, and he's there when that occurs. And his big conversion happens when he's on the road to Damascus. And bright light, hears Christ say, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And that's the beginning of his conversion. And he uses that zealousness that he has. I mean, he is so zealous. He uses it for now converting people to Christianity, right? And he led the way in combating Gnosticism, right? And Gnostics kind of said, well, Christ has a phantom body, right? So he was just spiritual. So he really wasn't physically incarnate. And, Paul takes that head on. And he argues against it, he preaches against it, and he takes it head on. So I think what we see in St. Paul is certainly God gave him this talent of being a zealous person, passionate, deeply excited, and deep belief in what he's doing. But God wanted to use it for good. Not what St. Paul thought was good or what Saul thought was good, but what God knew he had created him for. So that is a big conversion story. And then, of course, another one that you're probably familiar with if you listen to anything on saints or have read anything on saints is St. Augustine, right? We've heard about him a lot. And the idea is that, he was searching. That's one of the things we can say about St. Augustine. He was searching. And he had a wonderful mother, St. Monica, and he really kept reading. And at the age of 19, he read a book by the Roman statesman Cicero. He was a philosopher too. And it really moved him to adopt the pursuit of truth. He was always seeking the truth. And so he got wrapped up in some things that were not of the truth. And it took him time to realize that. Like he was a Manichaean, but he really knew that this wasn't right, right? He kind of continued to think about it and even, question people that were leaders in the Manichaean movement. And he ended up then giving that up. It's interesting because he then hears about Ambrose, Bishop Ambrose, and he hears he's a wonderful preacher. Again, notice he's open to the truth, right? He's really searching this pursuit of truth. So he goes to hear Ambrose, and he's quite taken by the way Ambrose preaches. And so he's thinking there is truth here, but yet he has the struggle, right? He struggles between giving himself totally to God because he'd have to give up the way of the world. He had a mistress. He had an illegitimate son, right? All of these things were going on. And he says he was torn by two wills, one of the servant of the flesh and the other of the spirit. And so he knew what was going on, right? He was ready to pursue the truth. He was pursuing the truth, but he was still held tight by the sinfulness. But when he opened Scripture and read the first passage, right, the first passage, he understood that he needed to change. It's interesting because he says, in silence, I read the first passage in chapter 13 of the letters to the Romans on which my eyes fell. Talk about divine providence. This is what he read. Not in reveling and drunkenness, not in lust and wantonness, not in quarrels and rivalries. Rather, arm yourself with the Lord Jesus Christ. Spend no more thought on nature and nature's appetite. Wow. Talk about how the Lord was speaking directly to him. That was it. And so, knowing that he could only do this with the grace of the Lord, he gives himself to the Lord. He and his son were baptized on Holy Saturday the following year, and St. Monica died that autumn. She saw the fruition of the grace and of her prayers. So we see that Augustine, his turning point, we could see it marked by, it was a slow turning point. It wasn't like, boom, converted, here I go, right? It was, I heard these wonderful speakers, these wonderful philosophers, the Bishop Ambrose, they're making sense. I see truth here. But yet he was still being held in the clutches of the flesh. And when he finally picked up Scripture, when he believed it was the Lord telling him to pick this up and look at it, he knew what he had to do. And from there, right, he goes on to be just an amazing saint. So I think one of the things we certainly see in him is that, he becomes a person who becomes chaste, and he decides to be open to the truth of real things and to live by the truth. And I think that obviously is something that all of us can do. The next one that they talk about is St. Thomas More, one of my favorite guys. St. Thomas More, he early on lived in a Carthusian monastery as a young man. He thought he'd be a monk, and he even started wearing a hair shirt, a practice that he continued his entire life. He became friends with Erasmus, and Erasmus did not like the church, the Catholic Church, but both he and More thought that the church could use some reforming at this time, right? But we know certainly that More is in place when the Protestant Reformation comes, when King Henry decides to appoint himself the head of the Church of England. It's very interesting because he is someone, Thomas More, who didn't set out to get wrapped up in all of this, right? He wasn't out there on the front lines, saying, this is wrong, this is really wrong. He tried to kind of stay quiet. I don't want to say stay quiet, but he prayed, right? But he saw what was going on. And he knew things that Luther had some legitimate complaints. And of course, the Council of Trent, as we know, addressed all those things. But More, very interesting, he writes, "Grant me an easy death when thou takest me to thyself. I do not presume to suggest whether it should be late or soon, but if it is thy will, I would much rather come to thee by a most painful death than to be kept too long away from thee by the most pleasant of earthly lives." Wow, think of that prayer, right? He's not trying to tell God, take me now or take me later, right? That he knows that's God's purview, right? I'm not going to presume to do that. But he said, I would rather come to you by a painful death than to be kept too long away from you, because I've got this pleasant earthly life going on, that everything is good and wonderful in my life. So Thomas More certainly is in the midst of all of this, and we know Henry's issue, King Henry's issue, right? He wants a divorce because he's not having a son, and Rome said no, you cannot get a divorce. And so More kind of knew that this was going to end badly, especially for Henry. And certain things he could not in good conscience press Henry's case for a divorce. So he knew he couldn't go forward and support Henry. And so More resigned his office as Lord Chancellor in May of 1532 and retired to what he trusted would be a tranquil private life, right? So this is interesting. More decided that, well, I can't cooperate in this evil. I will not put this forward. I will not put it forward in the church. I won't fight for Henry because it's wrong. But as hard as he tried, he couldn't overcome it. He didn't take the oath to Henry. He kept quiet, but he ends up anyway being arrested and taken in because he would not support Henry and he would not take the oath of loyalty to Henry. So again, we see it very interesting that More tried not to create waves, right? He wasn't going to support what Henry was doing. He was going to stay faithful to the church. But when push came to shove, More didn't have, he couldn't stay quiet any longer. He wasn't going to support him. And it's interesting, he said his execution took place on July 6th. It says, More's last words spoken to the executioner were, "You will give me this day a benefit greater than any mortal man could give me." Whoa! Think about that. He's telling the executioner that. So we know that More had a deep love for the Lord, and even though he could not support Henry, and even though that was going to be the undermining of him, he still did the right thing, and he always knew where he wanted to be, and he longed for that. So I think, again, we see that St. Thomas More is an amazing man. The next one they talk about is Ignatius of Loyola, right? And again, this is another, where's the turning point here for Ignatius of Loyola? Well, I think, and as we all, I shouldn't say we all, but if you're familiar with Ignatius of Loyola, you know that the turning point for him was his injury, right? He was certainly a very well-off person. He was 30, his transformation, Shaw says, was in fact something that Ignatius himself had experienced, although in this case it took much longer than the mere 30 days that the exercises took, right? So again, we see this wasn't like a one and done. Woo, I had this big experience of the Lord, and now I am ready to go. For Ignatius of Loyola, for St. Ignatius of Loyola, I always start talking about Francis de Sales, so I turn him around sometimes. So I want to make sure I'm talking about the right guy to you. But he certainly, using his own words, right? He said he was a gamer. He had affairs with women. He dueled. He liked to be in armed affrays. All right. So he had a very kind of, as St. Paul and as Augustine would say, he had a real worldly or a fleshy life in a sense. But the dramatic event, it kind of followed this lengthy process in his life. He was hurt. He was injured and in battle. And so he had these long months of recovery. And he was at a place called Manresa. And if you've heard, there is a Jesuit retreat house up in Michigan called Manresa, I think it is. But Ignatius certainly, during all this physical suffering, was kind of bored because he was an active guy. So he started to look for books to read. And the only books that were around, again, talk about divine providence, was the ones on the life of Christ and the volume of saints' lives. Isn't that interesting? I mean, there weren't any novels, none of that kind of stuff, right? And so he reads about Francis and Dominic, St. Francis, St. Dominic. And so he wanted to go to the Great Marian Shrine. And he was only going to stay a few days while he kind of kept experiencing this deeper spiritual illumination and this having kind of a profound change occurring. And he made a general confession. And he was always pretty proud, but he decided he was going to beg for alms, live with the poor, dress in rags. And he did this for a while. And then he turned to the reading of The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. It's a classic. I tell people all the time, read Thomas à Kempis. I read The Imitation of Christ, I don't know, 5th, 6th grade, I think. And it was amazing. And I still obviously pick it up from time to time and read from it. But the big turning point that Shaw says for Ignatius was the great illumination of spirit that came to him as he sat on the bank of the nearby Cardona River. It was not a vision, but understanding and knowledge of many things, some concerning spiritual things, others concerning faith and human learning. All the helps God gave him during his whole life. Moreover, this enlightenment remained with him, so that he seemed to himself afterward a different man, possessed of a new intellect. Isn't that interesting? The idea that a new intellect. So it wasn't just a feeling. He saw things differently. He thought about things differently, and that was his turning point. And as we finish up talking here about St. Ignatius of Loyola, these first four, I think, that we talked about are ones that you're pretty familiar with. The second half of the show, I want to talk about some, especially that I didn't know about, two in particular that I knew nothing about. And then we'll touch on a couple of the other ones that you may have heard their names or know a little bit about them. So come back on the other side of the break as we continue to talk about turning points, how 13 remarkable men and women heard God's call. I'm Pat Odie Murray, your host.
Husbands, have you ever worried about the risks to your wife's health from the birth control method she's using? Why not learn a natural method that's 99% effective and has no risks to her? You can learn natural family planning in English or Spanish through classes or home study. Search for a class at the Couple to Couple League's website at ccli.org or call 800-745-8252.
Catholics acknowledge the papal authority of Peter through Jesus' threefold blessing over Peter in Matthew 16, verses 15 to 19. Jesus gives Peter a new name, Rock, upon which he will build his church, and gives Peter the keys to the kingdom, quoting nearly verbatim from Isaiah 22, verse 22. Yet Protestants claim, by getting behind the English to the Greek, that Jesus was the Petra, or large stone, and Peter was a mere Petros, or little pebble in Greek. However, when you get behind the Greek to the Aramaic, the language that Jesus and the apostles spoke, Jesus says in both places, "You are Kepha," Aramaic for rock, "and on this Kepha I will build my church." 4 times in Galatians and 4 times in 1 Corinthians, Paul preserves Peter's new Aramaic name by calling him Kepha. Examining the truths of the Catholic faith, this is faithforensics.org.
Started drinking beer on Saturday nights, sleeping in on Sunday mornings, missing Mass, and it just became a pattern and continued. Without God, I don't know where I'd be right now. I feel like I'm whole again. I know the importance of the Eucharist. I know the importance of the sacraments that I didn't know at a young age.
If you've been away from the Catholic Church, visit CatholicsComeHome.org.
Hello and welcome back to the Virtuous Life. I'm your host, Pat Odie Marie, and today we're talking about turning points, how 13 remarkable men and women heard God's call. And it's a book by Randall Shaw, and Randall doesn't do interviews anymore. Boy, how I wish he would, because there are so many things in here. Obviously, this is a very concise book, but there's so many things I would have loved to ask him about. But in the first half of the show, we kind of talked about, in my mind anyway, 4 saints where I think even had I not read this, I would have been able to point and gotten pretty close to where their turning point was in their life, in their faith, their conversion story. But this next one that I'm going to talk about, I knew nothing about. And to tell you the truth, I think that if he's one of these guys that if you read about his life, you're going to wonder, like, was he mentally healthy? You really will. Because he took on a life that even Shaw says it could have been misinterpreted, right? And so, and Shaw is very clear that all of these saints have something to speak to us about today. So it's not just about the turning point in their lives, but it's also the idea that they still speak to us in our lives today. So let's talk a little bit about Saint Benedict Joseph Labre. I think it's Labre. Very interesting. He wanted to go to a monastery. All right. That was his thing. He felt called to go to a monastery. Now, I want to read this to you because this is what Shaw says at the get-go, talking about Saint Labre. He said, somewhat surprisingly, though, God seems at other times to show no less preference for saints who stand conspicuously apart from the secular currents of their times. Perhaps his intention in these cases is to remind us that measured by the scale of eternity, the issues exercising us here and now do not matter as much as we are tempted to imagine. That's a mouthful, but it's very true. That Saint Benedict Joseph Labre, he is that kind of person. He stands outside of the current time in which he lived to kind of remind us that all the stuff we get involved in and think are so important really isn't. And there's a historian who calls Saint Benedict Joseph Labre one of the strangest saints in the history of the church. Again, interesting guy. So he chose to be a homeless vagabond who spent years on perpetual pilgrimages to the great shrines of Europe, and he died of malnutrition after living as a street person in Rome. Very interesting. He really believed early in his life that he was called to be a monk, right? And so he certainly started to try to do just that, go to various monasteries, and they weren't accepting him. Okay, they wouldn't accept him. He went to northern France, to a monastery. He wanted to become a Trappist. Someone else, the Trappists rejected him, so somebody mentioned the Carthusians. And so he was 18, so he sent off to go to the Carthusians. But 2 Carthusian monasteries also rejected him, with the second one pointing out that before it could accept him, he would have to learn plain chant and logic. So he went home and he did that, right? He learned plain chant and logic, and then he returned to the Carthusian monastery, but he lasted only 6 weeks as a postulant. So here, this is where it gets very interesting, right? He says to his parents, "Give me your blessing, and I will never again be a cause of trouble to you. I very much hope to be received at La Trappe, but if I should fail there, I am told that the Abbey of Sept Fons, which is another Trappist monastery, they're less severe and will receive candidates like me." But he was wrong again. He didn't get in to either of them. But he was he was wrong. He didn't get into La Trappe. I'm sorry. So then he goes to Sept Fons, and he is admitted, but he only is there for 8 months. But the community was very impressed with his humility, his exactness of observing the rule. His health started to have issues because he would fast, do extreme fasts. And so after he spent time in the infirmary, after a severe fast, the Trappists asked him to leave. So here we have a young man who has tried so hard to get into a monastery because he believed that's what he was being called to. So after he is asked to leave the second Trappist monastery, he says this. He didn't get into the first one. The second one he got into. He writes his father and mother and says this: "My dear father and mother, you have heard that I have left the Abbey of Sept Fons, and no doubt you are uneasy and desirous to know what route I have taken and what kind of life I intend to adopt. I must therefore acquaint you that I left Sept Fons in July. I had a fever soon after that which lasted 4 days, and I am now on my way to Rome. I have not traveled very fast since I left on account of the excessive hot weather there, always in the month of August in Piedmont, where I now am, and where on account of a little complaint I have been detained for 3 weeks in a hospital where I was kindly treated. In other respects, I have been very well." But he goes on to say there are in Italy many monasteries where the religious live very regular and austere lives, and I design to enter into one of them, and I hope that God will prosper my design. And he goes on to tell his parents, "Do not make yourselves uneasy on my account. I will not fail to write you from time to time." And then he has a few words about his brothers and sisters. But he says, right, that here I am, I'm going to Rome. I know there's some good stuff there. But this was the last letter that was known to be written to his parents. He was disappointed time and time again that he didn't get admitted to another monastery. But he kept praying, trying to figure out, what is God really asking of me? And Archbishop Goudier explains this turning point for Saint Benedict Joseph Labre. He could not live in the confinement of a monastery. Then the whole world should be his cloister. There he would live a lonely life with God, the loneliest of lonely men. He would be a tramp, God's own poor man, depending on whatever men gave him from day to day, a pilgrim to heaven for the remainder of his life. So he kind of lived, as they say, a perpetual pilgrim. Now again, people, you would think, well, what? Right? What is going on here? Well, he actually ended up meeting and staying on a farm for a while, the parents of St. John Vianney. He constantly was praying and looking and moving toward shrines and helping others and allowing others to help him. He went to the Holy House of Loreto, right, which was the dwelling where Mary received the Annunciation. He slept in the ruins of the Colosseum. Just had a great Eucharistic devotion, would go into churches and just pray for hours on end before the Blessed Sacrament. He even, Caravaggio, actually painted him, did portraits of him. He collapsed outside of a church and was carried to a nearby house where he died of malnutrition. He was 35. But everyone in the neighborhood cried and prayed for him. People knew him. And it said great crowds came to view his body lying in state in a church near the Colosseum. And there beside the main altar, he was buried on Easter Sunday afternoon. Now, this is a life that most of us would say, oh my gosh. But I think there's so many things we can learn from this, right? The idea that sometimes what we think God is calling us to, he's not. And here's where it becomes very difficult, because we read in Scripture all the time, persevere, persevere. But persevere in what? And we have to ask ourselves, is this my will or the will of God? Am I persevering because I want this, or am I persevering because I believe God wants this, but it's just not going to be easy? These are hard things in all of our lives. But I think St. Benedict Joseph Labre showed that he understood. He really thought he was being called by God to monastic life. And doors just kept closing. And finally, in prayer, he came to the insight that this isn't what God asked of him, that the whole world was to be his monastery. That's a much different way of understanding how God calls us. But he had this great devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, and it's something, again, that we can learn from. It's not that we have to go out and live on the streets, but it is, right, this voluntary practice of poverty, that he chose that so he could grow in love of God. Another good thing we have to ask ourselves, right, when we look at him, are we practicing poverty in any way, shape, or form, or every time we want something, do we get it? Do we offer things to God? Because the idea here is God's providence too. Do we trust in God's providence? I mean, just think of how this saint, St. Benedict Joseph Labre, trusted in God's providence. He trusted God would take care of him. Now, you know, I don't know about you, but I'm kind of a planner, and I like to kind of, okay, this is the way this is going to go. But sometimes I just don't stop and say, okay, this is in your hands. The day I'm taping this show, the day before, I got to talk to Monsignor Lawrence Spiteri, and you heard the show last week. And after the show was over, he and I were on the line for like another 20 minutes. And I just knew at that moment that that was what I was supposed to be doing. I was supposed to be talking to this man, the great insights he was sharing with me. How did I get that? Well, St. John Henry Newman was made doctor of the church. So Monsignor Spiteri wrote the book, and so I read the book, and I got to talk with him. I just believe so often, and like our bishop says so often, it's not coincidence, it's providence. And I really think that's true. People say it's fate. No, it's God's providence. We are at certain places and times in our life for a reason, and we need to be aware of that. I hear people say, well, you were born for this time and place. And I think God brings people into our lives at certain times and places. It's part of his providence. There is a reason that person comes into our lives at that time. There is a reason that maybe what I am praying for I'm not getting. So these are the things that we need to be aware of. and certainly stay close to and pray about. Okay, so I thought he was one I'd never read much about at all. So he was a new one for me. The next one in the book is St. John Henry Newman, and since we did a whole show on him last week, I am not talking much about him. The next one is St. Therese of Lisieux. Again, if you're Catholic and involved with saints, she is a given. But I read a lot on St. Therese of Lisieux, and she definitely had a turning point in her life. She said, I asked Jesus to draw me into the flames of his love. She really, and she was a precocious child, which makes a lot of sense because she lost her mother quite young. And she was very, I don't know if you want to say moody, temperamental, whatever. But she had an experience when she was sick and in prayer as a very little girl. This Mary statue, she felt Mary's love coming to her as a mother. And so she left behind kind of this self-absorbed child life that she had. And that's why at age 15, right, even though she was underage, she went to the Carmelite convent. And it was just an amazing woman there. She talks about extraordinary things in ordinary ways. So she had this turning point very early in her life. But the other thing, in another book that I'm reading on St. Therese, she also said it is sometimes you have to use tough love, and because she was novice director, and she said, there are times I had to be tough, and it upset some of the novices, and sometimes they would cry, but I wouldn't, and they'd run out of the room. I wouldn't run after them because they needed to sit with and think about what Therese has said. And she was afraid that if she would go there, she might backtrack a little bit, but that is what they needed. And I think of that often. That's got to be the thing with parenting, right? Because she talks about her vocation being love. But we tend to think of love as being this kind of soft, squishy, warm, fuzzy, love you up and give you anything you want, right? That's not what Therese found at all. She said, yeah, sometimes love needs to be a tough love. Sometimes it needs to be warm and fuzzy and comforting. Other times it needs to be challenging. But she talked about her spiritual childhood. And I think that is different. And she's very clear that is not being childish, but a spiritual childhood, meaning that I run to God and have this relationship with God like a child has with the parent who loves them so much. So certainly, again, we learn a lot about St. Therese in her work, and again, very well known. And she had doubts and fears. As she at times had maybe what we might call a little dark night of the soul, but she always persevered. She prayed even when she didn't feel like praying, when she wasn't even sure that God was listening to her. But she proposes and she practiced that we speak to God as a child speaks to a loving and trusted father. So again, St. Therese, early turning point in her life, which was great because she dies at age 24, right? Now, here's one, St. Paul VI. Now, the only reason I bring him up, because this is where I had a really big question for Russell Shaw, the author. Because I'm thinking, what would have been, Pope Paul VI, St. Paul's turning point? Because I think that it's very, what's the word I'm looking for? Very difficult to understand maybe the turning point. And Russell, the author, Russell Shaw, said it was the writing of Humani Vitae. He spends a lot of time on Humani Vitae. And so I really read that and stayed with it, but he said this was the point where he found himself having to pay dearly for his interpretation, his deep convictions on what the church taught about artificial birth control, and especially in the midst of of a society where this was starting to be looked at as just okay. And so he said the writing of this and consulting with various priests and couples, that everyone, well, not everyone, but numerous people on this committee thought that he would definitely approve of artificial contraception. But he didn't. And in fact, Germain Grisey, who is just, I've heard him speak. He is an amazing guy. He was an American philosopher teaching at Georgetown University. And he actually published a very carefully reasoned defense of the church's teaching on contraception. And so he was brought in also. So St. Paul VI was really caught. And he was caught in the sense that people were trying to persuade him that, well, the birth control pill might not be contraception at all. So therefore, it really isn't in conflict. So it really, he was really in the midst of a battle here. And it wasn't very long, according to Shaw, and I've heard the quote, but I wasn't really sure when it was uttered. But he said, Pope Paul declared that the smoke of Satan has entered the temple of God. And that was in 1972. So he understood that there were people even within the church that were trying to take away the teachings of the church. And he felt, and he was under attack for this. But he was a very quiet and kind of humble man. And this, I guess, was his turning point in the sense that it challenged him that he had to stay strong and he had to speak the truth. And especially within his own church, right? When people within his own church was attacking him. So I found that very interesting because I kept thinking, how did St. Paul VI, what was his turning point like? Now, we are not going to have time to go through all of these that are left. Dorothy Day is mentioned. C.S. Lewis is mentioned. Now, these would be remarkable men and women who had conversions. St. Jose Maria Escriva is mentioned. But in the couple of minutes that are left, I want to talk about, and I think it's Carol Houselander. She was an amazing writer. She died in 1954. And the one thing that, and they say she was a little eccentric, right? But she was probably one of the finest spiritual writers of modern times. And she had a remarkable talent for empathy with people who were suffering. She smoked heavily, right? She enjoyed her gin and her wine, and they say she even had a really sharp tongue, and she employed it at the expense of people who annoyed her. So, right, I mean, there was definitely a humanity there about her. But there was something she wrote in ways that she tried to know the mind of Christ, Christ's love, Christ's sacrifice. And in her autobiography, she says she was a rocking horse Catholic in contrast with a cradle Catholic because she kind of came back in a sense. But one of the things that amazed me about her is that she had what they called life-changing visions. She had 3 of them. And one was a sister who was polishing shoes, a woman polishing shoes by herself. And so she said, at last with effort, I raised my head, and then I saw the nun was crowned with a crown of thorns. And I said to her, I would not cry if I was wearing the crown of thorns like you are. And I sat down beside her, and together we polished the shoes. So she saw in that service that it was sacrificial. And the one, though, that really amazed me, and she had another one about Nicholas, the Tsar of Russia, when he was killed. But she had been on a train, and she comes out, the third vision. She was on this underground train, a subway, and when she was sitting there, quite suddenly I saw with my mind, but as vividly as a wonderful picture, Christ in them all. But I saw more than that. Not only was Christ in every one of them, living them, dying in them, rejoicing in them, sorrowing in them, but because he was in them, and because they were here, the whole world was here too, here in this underground train. Not only the world as it was at the moment, not only all the people in all the countries, but all those people who had lived in the past and all those yet to come. I came out into the street and walked for a long time in the crowds, and it was the same here on every side, in every passerby, everywhere, Christ. Now, as we end the show, I think this is something we need to think of as we go through this month, but always, everyone you look at and see Christ within them. It will change the way you talk to them. It will change the way you interact with them. It will change the way you love them. Thanks for listening to The Virtuous Life. I'm your host, Pat Odie Murray.